Good morning and welcome to this webinar on understanding EUC risk and taking steps to reduce it. You'll hear from presenters from CIMCON Software and also from KPMG today. Before I begin, let me introduce our speakers. We have Will Heffernan from the Business Solutions team here at CIMCON. We're going to look at some of the tools that can be used to mitigate EUC risks later on in the webinar. We're joined by KPMG's Risk Consulting Modelling team. Dr. Ollie Boston and Ronan McCann are with us. We're going to hear principally from Dr. Ollie Boston as he talks us through some of the challenges with getting to grips with EUC risks. We just quickly touch on the agenda then. So we have 30 minutes for the webinar this morning. We'll discuss the size of EUC risk. We'll look at the processes at departments that are most vulnerable. We'll also look at the EUC environment for risk management and what can be done to reduce it. In the second half of the webinar, we'll take a look at how technology can support the mitigation of these EUC risks. But for now, I'll hand over to Dr. Ollie Boston.
My name is Ollie Boston. I started my career some 20 years ago or more building Excel models, and now spend much of my time at KPMG managing EUCs and their development and helping customers and clients to do exactly the same. So EUCs, just so we're all on the same page and have a shared understanding, as it's a term that not everyone is familiar with, end-user computing, or EUCs, are end-user focused application development environments. The software environment is generally fairly simple, such that non-developers or programmers, who are typically the main user groups, can undertake potentially complex analysis. A common and obvious example of EUCs of interest to us are Microsoft Excel files, also known as models or spreadsheets. Other examples include Microsoft Access files, ClickView, Tableau, and the list goes on. Taking Excel as an example, and yeah, I might add, my wife did buy me an I Love Spreadsheets mug for Christmas. It's an extremely powerful, flexible, and rapid to deploy tool that can be used with minimal skills. Unsurprisingly, Excel is the go-to tool for many organizations. On the flip side, however, this power, flexibility, and timeliness comes with a hidden cost, and that cost is risk. And for organizations who choose to ignore it, it may be more costly than they can afford. So what is EUC risk, and what are the risks? Well, there are a number of them, and they include the obvious ones of authenticity error, the drivers of which could be an erroneous data input, a formulaic error, a logic flaw, or just simple misinterpretation of the output. Research by EUC has found that around 90% of Excel models contain errors, and perhaps of more concern, more than 50% of models used operationally contain material errors. Other risk examples include compliance, say around the use of holding personal data, continuity, where say the organization has access to the Excel file but not the person in the organization who knows how to operate it. Another risk example is security, which may include inadvertent loss of sensitive information. I've personally received Excel files that have been that contain hidden sheets with sensitive information on them. And the impact of these risks materializing may vary from the basic dented pride on the behalf of the developer to something potentially more significant and more severe, which may include organizational-wide reputational, financial, or strategic impacts, sanctions, or potentially worse. So moving on to some examples, cautionary tales. When I say significance, what I really mean is Microsoft Excel might be the most dangerous software on the planet. Really? That serious, you ask? It's all become so complex, and it's handled in such a slapdash manner that no one is really on top of it anymore. But there's another deeper level of risk here. That is, the very throwing of trillions a day around the markets is dependent upon the existence of Excel itself. Now, this is a quote from Tim Worstel, an economics writer and fellow of the Adam Smith Institute. And this may all sound a bit too big to be true, but the reality is that EUC risks have materialized in a high-profile way for a number of organizations. This slide shows a small selection of cases that have made the press. There are many more, and I suspect even more that still don't make the press. And during the course of my work and the work of my team, we've witnessed many EUC horror stories, including one example that I witnessed, which was an error north of £1 billion that got to ministerial level, but fortunately for those concerned, it didn't get any further. I think the brutal fact is that those who use EUCs often underestimate the risks, and those who rely on their outputs may be completely oblivious to them. Just picking one example off this slide, Rogoff and Reinhardt, which you may well have heard of, a couple of professors whose theories were in the public domain on economic policy, and relatively recently the analysis that underpinned that, which was in an Excel spreadsheet, was found to be erroneous, and it is believed that the impact of that has had a detrimental effect on economic policy and fiscal policy at a country level quite broadly. So the big question from this is how can you address EUC risk? You should now have a feel for what EUCs are, some of the associated risks, which brings us really to the thrust of the WebEx, which is how you address them. And whilst there are many fundamentals, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach, other than to say that taking steps to cultivate an EUC environment that is appropriate to your organisation will reduce the risks. And the more developed your environment, the lower the risks will be, with the ultimate goal of controlling and managing risks to an acceptable level, but without sacrificing the usefulness and very essence of EUCs themselves. So what do I mean when I talk about the EUC environment? Well, at an individual EUC asset level, the stages of plan, build, test, use and manage provides a good framework to think about EUCs, although for those ultimately responsible for EUC risk, they should probably consider a broader environment. And in our experience, the EUC environment can be characterized by three interrelated areas of people and culture, infrastructure, and governance and control. And when we explore this framework, it begins to highlight the breadth of the EUC environment and the need to consider it fully in order to appropriately manage the EUC risk. I appreciate there's quite a lot on this slide. It gives some examples of the topics to consider, and for each of these topics, the appropriate approach will be unique to your organisation. If we walk along the asset development lifecycle, which you may be familiar with, we can begin to see the breadth of the EUC environment. So if we take the plan stage, you may want to think about how you assess the potential risk of a model to make sure you've got the right staff and the team structure engaged to build and manage it. You may also ask how you decide on a proportionate level of quality assurance and what that entails. Breaking it down further, you begin to ask, well, what training have your staff received? And is this training alone sufficient, or do they also require experience? And how do you assess this experience? Do you need accredited developers for certain high-risk models, and how do you accredit your staff? And is one developer sufficient, or do you need senior oversight? Which brings you on to, well, what's the career path for developers, and how do you keep hold of senior developers for continuity purposes? And for model planning itself, what the specification should entail, what templates are available to guide the specification development process. Thinking about the build stage, you may ask questions around what standards are available to build the models to. Excel standards, VBA standards, database standards, etc. Are they in line with best practice? How are they updated to reflect the evolving environment? And are there any generic templates or approved code libraries, for example, to help drive consistency of approach? What are the configuration control requirements, and are there any templates to support this? Moving rapidly on to the test stage, you may start to ask questions around what testing procedures and standards are available, who's been trained in them, how do they vary with inherent model risk, how do you deal with any issues identified, what tools do you have to help you automate the review process, and how sufficient are they, which risks do they capture, and how do you assess and quantify the maturity of the data that underpins the model itself. At the use and manage stages, you begin to ask questions like, who's the senior responsible owner? What training have they received to support this role? And do they understand their responsibilities? How's the model going to be used? How's it going to be governed and controlled? What certification exists for a model? And how is this maintained? And how are the changes within the model handled over its lifetime? And in the broader context, you start to ask questions around what team structure you have is in place, how the team share information and insights amongst each other, and how is this used for continuous improvement, and how do you maintain independence, and are the reporting lines in your team appropriate? I'll stop there, as this should give you a bit of a flavour for the EUC environment, although I think one point that's worthy of note is that it's good to think of all of these topics as links in a mesh, and if one of these links is weak or broken, it may have a knock-on impact on others or in itself lead to a risk materialising. For example, you may have a first-class EUC policy in place, but if there's no monitoring or controls, it may be ineffective, as generally it's human nature to try and take a path of least resistance. So thinking about some of the practicalities of EUC management, the good news is that any organisation can cultivate an EUC environment, and our team have just helped a large client to stand up a centre of excellence responsible for cultivating such an environment across a few hundred analysts and their end customers. In our experience, the first step in this process is really addressing EUC risk is really getting a grip on the scale of the problem itself, and building up a picture of what the EUC environment looks like in your organisation and what the EUC landscape is. This might include, for example, running a workshop with key stakeholders to understand the reality of how EUCs are managed on the ground and to try and quantify those risks. It might include reviewing and assessing existing standards, training material, governance procedures, quality assurance procedures, and tools and templates that are available to underpin the EUC environment. Critically, I think it also involves understanding what the key EUCs are in the organisation, how they're used, in which departments, what are their data feeds, and what are the processes around them, and potentially undertaking high-level best practice assessments of those key EUCs or even detailed reviews of them. And once we've established this picture, the next recommendation is to really use the hard evidence from some of your detailed reviews and the insights you may have gained from some of your workshops and the deep dive analysis to basically establish what the current state of the EUC environment is, and then put in place measures to kind of put out any immediate fires, which may be errors you found through the process in your key EUCs, and then lay the foundation for good EUC management in the future. And once the EUC environment is established and you have the necessary tools, templates, procedures and governance and training in place, you can begin to think about new technologies and what can be exploited. And there are a number of useful tools and templates that can be used across these phases, including network scanning and inventory creation software, model auditing and review tools, monitoring and control software, EUC mapping tools, risk classification tools, and reporting and documentation templates. I'll now hand over to my colleague Will, who will talk about some of the tools in the EUC inventory armoury.
My name is Will Heffernan, and I'm the head here of Business Solutions at CIMCON in the actual UK. CIMCON have experience with helping companies control the real risk, as outlined by Ollie, from their EUCs for well over 15 years. And that's really helping people from large enterprises such as international banks, insurance companies, building societies, right down to smaller asset management firms and that type of business. Anywhere a model or an EUC or even anywhere Excel is actually being used. So how can technology help you control the real risk from uncontrolled EUCs, working within the EUC environment as been laid out by Ollie? Firstly, you will need to be able to create yourself an inventory of the files or the EUCs used in your key processes, anywhere these models are basically being used throughout the organisation. And CIMCON can provide it for you with our EUC Insight solution. So you can create this inventory manually if you already know the files you want to control and you've gone through some sort of self-assessment process, and you can upload that directly into EUC Insight. Or you can use EUC Insight to help discover your EUCs by scanning your network drives and finding those files that pose the most risk to your business. Even if you do have an inventory already, scanning can be used to selectively challenge the inventory on an ongoing basis. So with scans, you'll be able to say, these files look like EUCs. Are you sure you've got them all actually in your inventory already? However you create your inventory, we can store it. You can then add your own user-defined fields to store extra information necessary to support your internal EUC policy as laid out and defined through the environment. In these user-defined fields, or the metadata, you can record details such as the owner, i.e. the person responsible for the EUC, and data such as the impact to the business if the EUC should fail, whether it's used in important reporting, financial statements, etc., etc. Whatever has been identified as being important in the EUC environment can be included in this metadata or these user-defined fields. Okay, so we've done some scanning, we've got an inventory. You can then basically use EUC Insight to assess the files to create a risk rating. You can amend the default scoring system we supply, and you can fit that to the different ways your business units work across your enterprise. So we can do some automatic assessment on things like materiality or complexity, keywords, any errors in the files. And we can also use the information from those user-defined fields to calculate the risk rating, whether it's a high-risk file, should take a lot of control, medium or low risk. So from the scanning discovery phase, we'll also provide, amongst other things, a system-wide map or an EUC map, which will show you how your EUCs interact, which is perfect for finding broken links, outdated data feeds, even where a spreadsheet is being used in PowerPoint or spreadsheet data is being used in Word documents. And of course, dashboards and reports are provided as per any system. We'll have a little look at those in just a moment. What is the real output from the inventory? Well, it will produce, give you a list of high and medium risk files that you'll want to or need to put under control. And that's where the second part of CIMCON's EUC Insight comes in. Once you've decided on which files to control, it's a simple matter to start the process of controlling them within EUC Insight. Now, obviously one size doesn't fit all, as all businesses are different, so you can choose the level of control you want to enforce. At the minimum, you'll be able to record changes to the EUCs as they are saved. And you can use this change log to produce an audit trail as and when required. A simple approval process is included if you want to use it, driven from this automatic audit trail. But over and above that, you can selectively introduce other controls when you want to, if you want to, such as version control. So you can allow the developer to create new versions when they are ready to be released. And you can have access control. And this will prevent unauthorized changes to a spreadsheet, unauthorized access to a EUC, and it can lock down the formulas, for example, so users can only change the inputs and record the outputs from an EUC. We produce a workflow solution, and we can obviously get that installed if you want to use it, and that will fully automate the approval system via emails, etc. We can even alert users when drastic or catastrophic changes are made to an EUC, or tell you when it's time to reassess the risk of an EUC. All this, of course, will be driven from your EUC policy, and of course that will come from the environment and the work done by people like KPMG. A really important lesson here is that this control must not interrupt the workflow of the people building, amending or using the EUCs. So your developers and modelers, your quants, should be able to go about their business and do their work without having an overly heavy control system which they will resent using and in time would probably fall into disuse. It has to be delivered, the framework or the control mechanism has to be delivered where they work with minimal extra work for them. That's why you can implement EUC Insight to track changes in EUCs without involving the users at all if you want to. Or you can add a ribbon in Excel or Access to allow them to interact with the controls mentioned above directly in Excel. So, talking to the actual users, how can we help them to start the control the risk from EUCs? By providing tools for EUC analysis. And again, these should be delivered directly within Excel, and they're there to help anyone using Excel to build better spreadsheets in the EUCs. And this is not just your developers and modelers, anybody really in, say, the finance teams, quants, throughout the business should have this type of tool. EUC analysis tools such as this will find errors, inconsistencies and issues in spreadsheets, and these will allow the user to quickly fix problems before releasing their work. For example, it will detect any changes in cells in a block, highlighting if the user failed to select the full range when copying formula from one place to another. It can highlight where data is being hidden by having white text on a white background or behind an image, for example. We provide a spreadsheet comparison capability. So again, this will actually drive and show you changes being made between different versions of spreadsheets, right down to the code in VBAs and macros. We can produce documentary evidence or documentary proof that the EUC has been checked. And again, that saves a lot of time. It will also show data flowing into the EUC from upstream sources. So data moving between sheets or between cells. It will save you literally hours of work. It will save your modelers hours of work. It will thus drive best practice throughout your business.
Well, thank you very much. We're just coming to the end of the webinar now, so just to summarise, we've explored a few things here. We've looked at the EUC risks. We've looked at some useful cautionary tales. I think to quote Ollie, perhaps those that are relying on EUCs maybe are somewhat oblivious to the risks they pose. We've discussed the concepts of the EUC environment. We've looked at the interrelated areas of people and culture, of infrastructure, of governance and control, of course. We've also looked at practical EUC management, so obviously looking at CIMCON as a tool to support the understanding and monitoring of those EUCs. Well, we hope you've found the webinar to be useful and it's triggered some ideas that perhaps you can use in your own organisation. If you do have any questions and would like to find out more on the subject of understanding and dealing with EUC risks, by all means please use the contact details on screen now. A copy of the webinar and also the presentation that we've made today will be available to all attendees within the next 48 hours. Thank you for joining.